I think you can start, Timothy.
Okay, so I consent to the recording. In fact, as a terrorist, I've set the bombs to a timer and I need this alibi, damn it. So, I work for Automat, and I'm going to talk about error handling. First, I'm actually going to say a little bit about what Automat is and what I do at Automat. So Automat works in urban development, and urban development is kind of the study or the area that thinks about how we use urban space. I'm from the United States, and it's an issue that's very close to my heart because I grew up in a city that looked like this. Everything was a parking lot. 70% of everything was a parking lot. This is a typical center of the city in the United States.
Timothy, sorry to interrupt you. I think you are not sharing your screen.
Aha!
Oh, yeah.
Totally. Cela obrazovku
Yes.
allow. Povolit.
Yeah.
Now do you see it?
Yes.
Okay.
Great.
So this is, do you see it now?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. So this is a screenshot from Google Maps from my hometown, Bellevue, Washington. It's the center of the city, and there's a Starbucks and some kind of administrative building and a bakery, and 70 to 80% of the space is used by parking lot, by cars. And here is a part of Prague that has a Starbucks, a bakery, and some kind of administrative building. And you see that there's no giant parking lot, there's a big park, and urban space is used a lot more effectively. There are some parking lots here, and they're underground, so you can't see them. But the main difference is that my home city, 73% of people go by car everywhere, and only 12% go by mass transport, and that includes people who are working from home. Prague has 40% mass transport and only 30% cars, and for some reason this is a little bit broken, but there's also a very large percentage of people that go by foot everywhere. I actually also looked at what Brno looks like. Firefox. And I actually found Starbucks here, and it looks like a giant parking lot. But actually, this is a building, and the top floor is a parking lot, which is pretty clever use of space. So this is actually also decent use of space, that there's a building with a parking lot on top of it, rather than having 70 to 80% of the urban space just used for parking lot. But I'm not talking about parking lots today. I'm talking about what Automat does and some technical issues that we have. I work on Dopraca na kole, which is it's a výzva in the Czech Republic. I'm not really sure what you would call it, a competition maybe, where people sign up and they can try to ride to work by bike for an entire month. And we're trying to encourage more people to go by bike and fewer people to go by car. So we have this calendar, and they can select in a map how they went, and they can click on the events in the calendar to say that they want to work by bike. All of this runs on Django. So we have a system where a request comes to nginx, and nginx is there to handle connections, and the request is then sent to Unicorn, and I really don't know what Unicorn does. And then the request is sent to Django, which actually processes the request. And Django stores the information in PostGIS, and it also caches some things in Redis, and it also does some tasks in Celery, and Celery Beat runs to run some periodic tasks, which are basically cron jobs. We also store data in S3. We also store files in S3. So that's our architecture, and this is an extremely standard architecture for Django applications. I saw that somebody wrote something in chat. Visva challenge. Okay, thank you. Today, I'm going to talk about errors that happen in Django and how we handle them. And the first couple of slides are just some general things about like what the bad things that can happen when you have a web application. I think the worst cases are that you have a data leak and all of the personal information is stolen. That's pretty bad. You can also lose control of infrastructure and have somebody replace your entire website with a giant smiley face that's laughing at everybody. And it can also lead to a data leak, of course, when you lose control of your infrastructure. And that's maybe even worse because you have a data leak and also your service can be disrupted. And another thing that can happen that is terrible is silent data corruption and permanent data loss. And when I say silent data corruption, this is different from just data corruption. If I have data corruption and I see an error in Sentry, Sentry is a service that shows you the errors that have occurred in your program. It's kind of website that just has a list of errors that have happened. If you see the error immediately in Sentry, then you don't end up having permanent data loss. But if you back up your database every day and you start having data that's corrupted silently over time, then you might have months worth of backups that are useless because all of them are corrupted. And that's a really bad thing that happens. Less bad things are minor data leaks, minor data loss, and partial loss of control of infrastructure. For example, you might have it so that somebody's able to upload JavaScript to your front-end system, if your front-end is in S3, but they don't have control of your server, which is less likely to cause like major data leaks, for example. And there's also disruption of service and like minor embarrassment level loss of control. Minor embarrassment level loss of control is, for example, there have been small CSS or XSS injections on the JavaScript level that have allowed hackers to show a disturbing message, but it hasn't given the hacker actual control of the system, hasn't allowed them to steal data or anything, which is embarrassing, but not so terrible. Silent data corruption can happen when you have extraneous data added to your database. For example, if you have a workflow in which you receive payments, we use, for example, PayU, and we send out an HTTP request to PayU and then get back a response. And we create a row in a table every time we get a successful payment. Imagine that the payments were actually failing. We weren't getting the money, but we were adding rows. And we weren't able to then tell which payments were valid and which were invalid. That's a pretty bad thing, because then you have users that haven't paid for your service, but are using your service. And that can be caused by an exception going off at the wrong time. You created the payment, but you haven't yet verified it, for example. And writing your code correctly so that the payment object is only created after the payment is verified, rather than modified after it's been created, is like good practice. And when you're an experienced programmer, you write your code and so that it's in the right order. So if something bad happens at the wrong time, you don't end up with the wrong data. Another thing that can happen with silent corruption is you end up overwriting data that's valid with invalid data. And I tried to think of how this could happen in Django, and I'm sure there's ways it can happen, but none of them occurred to me. And the last thing that can happen is unwanted data deletion. And I think one of the most common ways this happens is that when you accidentally set up cascading deletion of objects, and you're deleting objects from your database, and you're accidentally deleting things that you didn't want to be deleting, because you set it to cascade. When you have a foreign key relationship, if the foreign key becomes invalid, you delete the object, for example. Or the other way around, if you have a foreign key to another object and you delete that object because you're pointing to it, yeah, you have to think about how deletion works in order to make sure you're not accidentally deleting data that you don't want to delete. There's also the category of disruptions to service, and you can have server errors that just cause your server not to work. You can have DDoS attacks, and they can be unintentional. It can just be because your code is so slow that your server doesn't work. And you can have hardware failures. And if your database gets corrupted in such a way that the server just throws an error, then obviously your server's not going to be accessible anymore. I don't know how I am on time, but I'm going to skip over this.
You have plenty of time. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, just
Okay,
great.
so now I'm going to go on to a demonstration of like the practical ways that Django tries to limit these problems. And so I've created a test application. And I put it on GitHub here. If you want to open it up, you can open up GitHub, and there's the Django errors repository. And I have all the code there. Hopefully I've pushed it all. And I've created this application, and I have a couple of views that do things. So the first view adds a thing to the database. I can see here in the admin that I have a new thing when I run this code, and it works correctly. You know, they say that you should never do a live demonstration during a talk, but this code is designed to crash, so hopefully it will crash. Usually you don't want your code to crash during a live demonstration. Here I create a thing. I'll show you the code quickly. Do you see the code?
Yep.
Okay, so here I have the add thing view, and it just does object create or objects create thing, and it sends a HTTP response. My next view is exactly the same code, only before the response, there's an exception. So you see the last thing was added at 17:33 and 48 seconds, and I run it again, and I have a new thing. So even though an exception occurred, the object is created. The next view that I created has this transaction.atomic decorator. And so here, add thing error atomic. The last PK is 15. If I go to add thing error atomic, no thing was created. So what is this error atomic decorator? What it does is it creates a transaction in the database. Here we're using SQLite, but all transactional databases support this in Django, which is, I think, all databases that are supported by Django, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. And what is a transaction? A transaction tells the database, I'm going to start doing things. From now on, I want you to write the changes to what's called the journal in journaling databases. And then I want you to flush the journal when I say to end the transaction. So the journal is a list of changes that you've done to the database. And the database itself is a set of tables. You haven't written the things to the tables, but you have written the changes to the journal. And at the end of the transaction, you flush that journal, or you apply that journal or whatever. I'm not really sure of the terminology. And the changes get applied to the database. So here we've created an object. That object creation has been written to the SQLite journal, but the journal hasn't been applied. An exception occurs, and Django then goes and tells SQLite, hey, roll back that transaction. Don't complete it. And the things in the journal that aren't committed just get deleted from the journal. And so no object is created. Hopefully I'm not saying anything too wrong here. And the next thing that I wanted to know is what happens if I create an object that has a save method, and that save method might have some side effects. So here I have the save method. It just prints out that the save method was run, the standard output. What do you think will happen? Does anyone have an idea? Will the save method be run? Well, right now, the first thing is this is without an error. So you see here, save method was run, and I also set up a post-save signal receiver. So that's without an error. What do you think will happen when I run it and there's an error and there's an atomic? It's atomic. Do you think the save method will be run? I wasn't sure about this. Does anyone have a guess before I run it?
Let's give it 10 seconds.
Yes.
You think that the save method will run. The transaction will be rolled back, but the save method will run. Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So you are correct. The save method is run. Which was, so if you have a side effect, like in your save method, the side effect will still apply, even though the transaction was rolled back. That's because this is atomic. This is an atomic view. And the next thing that I tried was I created a file field in my model, and I ran it in a transaction. The first thing I did was I tried when there's no error. Where's Dunar? And I get a file. I get a new file. If you want, I can do that again. And you see a file is created. Do you think that the file will be created? I can show you the code. So I've created a content file here, and I do file.save. Do you think the file will be created if there's an exception here before the transaction completes and the transaction gets rolled back? Does anyone have a clue? I guess whether the file will be saved?
Well, I would guess that the file would not be saved, but
I
sure.
also thought it wouldn't be saved, but no. So actually, this is a case of silent corruption. You end up with no object pointing to the media file. In this case, luckily, it probably doesn't matter. It's just basically disk space being used on your S3 instance or whatever you're using to store media files. But I consider this to be pretty weird behavior, actually. I don't like it. But yeah, there's an error that there's no. So if I go to things two, no object is created to point to that file. That file exists on the disk, but it's not pointed to by the file field. Whereas this, I have the file is pointed to. I don't have media files set up correctly, so I can't view it from here. But yeah, this points to a existing file, whereas some of the files aren't pointed to at all. The last thing I tried, like what bad could happen if an error occurs, we actually had a big problem that there was some downtime on our server. And what was happening is that we ended up in a loop where we were creating a bunch of celery tasks that were running. And the celery tasks were kind of growing explosively. And it was taking up more and more memory in Redis. And it caused our entire server to go down because the Redis cache was getting full. And we weren't able to access our cache. And so I thought, like, what happens if you just have an infinite loop in a view? So here I created a view called loop. And when the get method is called, we just do while true sleep 1. And this should never return. So right now, this request is being processed by Django. what do you think will happen if I try to open up another view? Will it respond? I'll do so in another tab. Do you think Django is currently inaccessible because this view is processing?
Doesn't depend on the unicorn there.
Yes, are you running Unicorn?
I'm not. I'm using the normal Django debug like run server command.
Then it'll probably not work.
It does work. So really, infinite loop is not going to cause your server to go down. This is a bad situation though, because you would end up having a resource leak. In Unicorn will kill it after a predefined number of seconds, and I think the default is 30, but don't quote me on that. Maybe that's the point of Unicorn. I'm not really sure. I still don't really get why Unicorn exists. So, but yeah, it still works even though there's an infinite loop happening. I don't know how to kill the loop except for killing the server. So maybe I'll kill the server. So that's the end of my like practical demonstration. And now I started it again. I'm so clever. That's the end of my like practical part of my demonstration. And now I decided to look at some real bugs that have happened at Automat recently that I fixed. And most of these bugs, I found out about them because either people were complaining or there were errors in Sentry. And if I was a good DevOps person, I would have found out about them almost instantly because there were errors in Sentry. But currently there's so many errors in Sentry that sometimes I'm not doing a great job of finding all of the errors that actually matter. So there was this problem that people couldn't upload GPX files to do pracy na kole. And the problem was that I changed the way Webpack was working, and I had ended up installing Leaflet in Webpack, but I still had Leaflet being loaded in the HTML in the template, and this was causing Leaflet to not have all of the proper plugins loaded. Specifically, it didn't have the GPX plugin loaded. When I showed you the hierarchy of horror, the bad things that can happen, this is really low on the hierarchy. No silent data corruption occurs. There's no risk of people hacking into the server and gaining control of it because of this. It's just a service disruption. The website doesn't work, and I see an error in Sentry. It's on the JavaScript level. Personally, I think a lot of people want to write in Python as much as possible because they just love Python, and JavaScript is disgusting. Even if you're writing in TypeScript, it's still not Python. But my personal belief is that we should move as much to JavaScript as possible, because errors in JavaScript, so long as your APIs, your REST APIs are written correctly in a secure and stable manner, there's nothing really bad that can happen in JavaScript. The worst that can happen is you have a service disruption. Or if you're an idiot and your software is completely insecure, then your software is insecure. Your REST protocol is insecure. It's not the JavaScript's fault. So you want to have as much of your like functionality, in my opinion, in JavaScript as possible. But of course, your mileage may vary. The next bug that I had was a form error that I had a bug in this code, and I'm not really sure how this bug happened, but this is just incorrect usage of this function. And whenever there was a validation error in this form, I got an error in Sentry, and they saw an error page whenever they submitted the form. In the hierarchy of horror, nothing bad happens. No new data is added to the database, no corrupt data, nothing bad. So you see in practice, we have 2 errors so far, and nothing terrible has happened. We've only had service level disruptions, which are bad, but they're not catastrophic. So Django is so far doing a good job. You get a form validation error, you just see, you get an exception in a form validation error. No objects are created on the database. You just see an error on the screen and in Sentry. this is the next error, and it was an error in the REST protocol. Again, I saw some error in REST, and or an error in Sentry, and it didn't lead to, since this was a view that only read data, it wasn't writing to the disk, there was nothing bad that could happen. There was no way that there could be a partial write to the database. And so again, nothing terrible happened. This was a really terrible bug. So I had a template called registration complete, which happened to collide with a template that is defined by Django, and I didn't know that. It was a name collision. And partially it's my fault, but there was no error in Sentry because Django supports overriding templates with templates of the same name. And this was an entirely unrelated template, and it was causing a view to not display properly, but there was no error in Sentry, and it was pretty hard for me to debug this. But again, there was no end of the world. There was nothing high up in the hierarchy of horror that could happen. There was no data corruption or anything. Here's another error that I had. Minimum distance is stored in kilometers, and I thought it was stored in meters somehow, and so I was converting it to kilometers, and they were seeing 0. Again, nothing bad happened. And so you see that, again, there's a bug, but it's not the end of the world. There's no ability for there was no service disruption here. There was just an improperly displayed message in the system. Here's the only bug that was anywhere high up in the hierarchy of errors. And this is interesting. Do you see the difference that's changed here? Anyone see it? Hello, hello, am I connected?
It's just the order of the subclassing, so it might matter because of method resolution order.
Yes.
I can take unqualified guess that some of these mixins are using some test function and they override each other. And
so what's the mixin that I moved? What's the mixin that I moved?
Well, from security perspective, the mixin that gives you the required login, not the login, but the login, right?
Yeah. So the login required mixin needs to be at the top of the mixins. I was getting an error in Sentry that the must be in registration phase mixin was raising an error. There was no actual security implications to this, but this is a good example of how you might end up with a security problem in Django. In this case, there was no security problem. I checked it carefully. But we were getting an exception in the must be in registration phase mixin because we were reading from the user, from the request. We were looking at the user session, and there was no user session because we weren't logged in yet. And so the error in Sentry that I was seeing was that the Google bot that's crawling the internet was walking on our page and causing an exception on this particular web page, on this particular view. But yeah, that's something that's extremely subtle, and I wouldn't have noticed, really, honestly. But be careful about that. So my experience from working with Django is that since Python is memory safe, there's not likely to be a lot of problems where you have, what's it called, heap injection or whatever you call it. I don't remember the name for it. Like in C, where you end up getting overwriting executable memory and being able to take control of infrastructure that way. In Python, that basically doesn't exist because it's a memory safe language. And the real bugs that we've experienced haven't led to any serious problems, though we have had some silent data corruption where some extraneous data was being created and it wasn't possible to distinguish between the real data and the fake, like the erroneous data. which is of course a problem. That's it for my talk. I hope you learned something, or at least were interested in some of the things that I had to say. And we have a lot of small errors in our system, I'd have to say. And I get a lot of emails like, nahrávání týmového fota, ahoj, přijde nezměnit a vymazat foto. I tried it, it worked. And I'm looking for a detective. They don't have to be a computer programmer, but somebody who's a detective. And when you get an email like that from somebody, that somebody called us up and said they can't change their team photo, we have to find out why they thought that it didn't work, or whether it does work. And another email that I got is that some kind of result in a competition wasn't what somebody expected. We don't know if it's correct behavior or not. We need a detective to find out. There's a great novel by Emma Ullman called The Bug. That's a detective novel about finding a bug. I really recommend it. And I think that you guys should all read it. It's probably only like great computer programming novel that I've ever read. Kind of sad, but it is a good novel, so go and read it. And here's my contact information. This is our GitHub. Everything that we write is open source. And here's the website of our organization. And here's my personal website. So thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Well, thank you, Timothy. We have a round of applause for you. That comes in. It was a brilliant talk. So yeah, we would like to go into the Q&A session now. We had very little questions through the chat, but we would like to open it up for anyone who would like to speak up. And also, I would like to note that the example you mentioned with what was it, kilometers to meters, being wrong scale. Then I guess some space industry expert would say that that can be catastrophic based on. We had I noticed one question there, and I'm not sure if that was the answer to that, but the presentation not related question, the command panel that you used for switching to Firefox and back, what is it? Can we get the link, please?
Ještě jednou, what was the question?
There was Adam, do you have a microphone working?
Yes, I hope so.
Yep.
I'm asking about the tool. It's like the single row at the very top of your screen, and I think it's you're using it for switching programs. So I'm just asking what tool is that? Thank you.
Timothy, you need to unmute.
Yeah, so let me switch back to Emacs and tell you. So I'm running Xmonad on Linux, and
yeah, but you're not sharing a screen right now, so
can you share a screen for a second?
So the switching is it's called Rofi, I think. No, that's the launcher, and go-to menu. It's just a built-in command in Xmonad. So the window manager is called Xmonad, and go-to menu is apparently a built-in command in Xmonad.
Hopefully that's
so
yeah.
It is an integral part of the Emacs?
No, it's an integral part of Xmonad, which is a window manager on Linux.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. And we had a little discussion there about the example you showed us with Django server and forever for loop or while loop or something. And we were trying to figure out what is actually causing that behavior. Have you investigated in further? If it's we had a wild guess of Gil, and then discussion.
So let's try what Peter Victor and I think wrote. While true, I equals 1, I plus 1. You see
Well, that was Mikko.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
So this is what you wanted to try, right?
Yeah.
So
So make it
so
a
now
busy
that
loop.
it's running, it still works. No change.
Okay.
So we don't know what is causing it actually, but we just see the effect.
We just see that it works.
Yeah, we see that it works, but we need to find out why. But in all fairness to Django server, they do state that please don't use me for production services.
I still don't understand why though. Nobody's explained to me, like, what does Unicorn do? It should be, why do you have a separate piece of software just to like pass on requests? It's confusing to me.
There's a good possibility.
Well, so if you have a more dumb server than the Django's one, which apparently does do multi-threading, Unicorn will do the multi-threading for you. So it'll so I think it'll actually spin up several servers for multiprocessing, and then have several threads in each one, and basically make it harder to debug your application, but better when you're serving more requests at once. And it takes care of all those scaling issues that you get, which as a developer, you don't really get into.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I had well, that's my question. So we had those examples and everything on Django, but this is not Django specific set of issues, right? This is pretty much generic that can happen on any kind of a framework.
Yeah, everything that I talked about applies to just about every framework, because every framework uses transactional databases. And there are other kinds of side effects other than data being committed to a database that can happen in any transactional system. So yeah, everything I said applies to everywhere.
Then we are all in danger, right? We had a request from Adam again that this event is called Pyvo and there's no beer on screen, but yeah, we are definitely taking a good care of getting hydrated the right way. Good. Do we have any more questions? Ideally related to the talk, but it doesn't have to be directly.
Maybe one small note unrelated to the talk. The launcher, Rofi, it has a mode when it shows the open windows, so that is also possible to scroll by them. And now the recording can stop.
Okay, let's stop the recording.
As you wish. All right, I'm stopping it right now.
Timothy, will you stay with us for longer?
Yeah, I will.
Okay, so any more questions, we can still put them on Timothy. Still recording.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. Let me try again.